Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Patty O'Malley, a member of the Frederick County Nature Council, the sponsor for this webinar. The Frederick County Nature Council is a Friends of the Park group, serving both Fountain Rock and Catoctin Creek Nature Parks in Frederick County by supporting the parks and improving the park experience for visitors. Our activities include volunteering for a park cleanup and gardening, organizing the annual Master Naturalist program for Fountain Rock, organizing citizen science projects and children's programs, and holding a fall flower sale. Membership is open to the public, so please contact us if you are interested in joining. Bradley Simpson is the restoration manager for Nature Forward, where his work in this field has included research as well as active management of urban forests. He has conducted urban forest research in New York City and at Nature Forward's headquarters, Wood End Nature Sanctuary, categorizing thousands of plants in the process. He currently manages the restoration of Wood End's natural habitats and interpretation of this work through both social media and tour programs. And Bradley, I'll turn it over to you now.
Right when the cat jumps in. Thank you so much, Patty, for the introduction. I'm excited to be here. I've done lots of winter woody plant ID presentations through the Virginia Native Plant Society, as well as through other Nature Forward programs. If you don't get enough winter tree ID today, I'll go ahead and I'll play this now. And at the end, I will be doing a 5-week extensive course through Nature Forward all on winter tree identification if this hour is not enough for you. But it is nice to be able to meet everyone for the first time and be with Frederick County Nature Council for the first time. Please ask any questions as we go through. I'll be introducing a lot of material and a lot of terminology, and I know it can seem like there's too much. I have also provided Patty a PDF version of my PowerPoint that is shareable. Hopefully when the recording is sent out to everyone, she'll also provide a copy of that presentation. It has all the botanical terminology I use, and it can be used as a reference as you move forward with your winter tree identification. So identifying trees in winter, the how-tos of twigs and bark. It says Habitat Manager here for my title. It's just a small change I made recently to be more accurate. But I do manage primarily the 30 acres of forest of our sanctuary in Chevy Chase right inside the Capitol Beltway. So very urban. With the urbanized area, you never know what woody plants might make its way into our area. So it's always good to know the popular landscape plants and how to identify them so you can figure out what is being introduced into our area. So this is me. I have a bachelor's in primarily wildlife ecology, but while I was at University of Maryland, I was a research technician for an urban plant ecology lab where I did research on forest restoration and invasive species within 4 of the 5 boroughs of New York City. I started at Nature Forward, which used to be the Audubon Naturalist Society, in 2018 as a Chesapeake Conservation Corps member. So a program through the Chesapeake Bay Trust. So if you have a Chesapeake Bay plate, thank you. You helped pay my stipend for a year to work with Nature Forward. And luckily enough, they did decide to keep me on as their primary habitat manager for the last 4 years. And I'm currently obtaining a professional degree in plant science through University of Maryland's Urban Forest Ecology Lab. So how to identify trees, this is true for any season, is we use characteristic features. These characteristic features are highlighted in things like dichotomous keys that are a series of paired choices that help you lead to the identification of your unknown plant. In winter, those characteristic features tend to be bark, thorns, types of fruit, the growth form, the hairiness of a bud, the color of a twig. So everything really except the leaves and the flowers. There are certain apps that do help with identification of our winter woody plants. My favorite is Virginia Tech Dendrology. Their dendrology department is amazing. Their online resource is also quite extensive. They have fact sheets and identification lists for many of the woody plants throughout Virginia. And while Maryland is a little bit behind the times in its having a documented flora. The Flora of Virginia is a great book to use since our plant life does overlap quite frequently. You can see the picture of the Flora of Virginia book by primarily weekly. The last time Maryland had its own flora completed, it was by Brown and Brown back in the 80s. So they have not. I can post links and references as well as we go through this presentation with the links, and it will also be shared with everyone at the end. And these links do work in the PDF version I've shared with Patty. So you should be able to access everything following the completion of this presentation. For Frederick County, you may want to consider even using the flora of Pennsylvania, since it does kind of include the more northern species that we might see in the Frederick County area. So tree ID tools, you can use a whole bunch of field guides. There's an entire book on bark. I like to use this winter tree finder here. This is a nice introductory dichotomous key that's only a few dollars. And it's a great starting point for learning how to identify trees in the winter. When you move up, this fruit and twig key by William M. Harlow is a nice next step, with this key being a even more technical step forward in your identification, as this includes all woody plants, native or non-native, that could be found east of the Mississippi. It's also important to have a hand lens, a ruler, a knife or pruner. Sometimes you have to look inside the stem, and of course trees are tall, so having binoculars to look at certain features on the stems far away is very important. You'll notice too, if you do look for books about winter tree identification, the Winter Tree Finder is the most recent. Let's see what year this was. I'm pretty sure it was the 70s is when the Winter Tree Finder was written. I can't find a date in my book. And then Harlow's key was back in the 1940s, so nothing too recent in our winter tree identification tools. I love plant taxonomy, so I always try to ingrain the importance of understanding the relationships between plants, as it helps us to associate certain features with between plants. For example, if you look at plants in the beech family, they tend to have leaves that turn brown and stay on the stems through winter, like the American beech, oaks, and chestnut. Trees and woody plants in the olive family have oppositely arranged leaves and stems. Cherries have horizontal lenticels on their bark, and oaks, their buds are always clustered at the ends of twigs, and their fruit type, of course, is the same as an acorn. So understanding these relationships can help us kind of hone in on our suspected plant or unknown plant. And I'll introduce what all of these terms mean as we move through the presentation. Botanical terminology is its own language. It is full of Latin and Greek roots. There is an entire book about plant identification terminology. So if you really wanted to get into terms, you can use this illustrated glossary by Harris and Harris. It's a great resource as basically a dictionary for botanical terms. Most keys will have a small glossary at the end. And here I've highlighted some of our more important terms that we'll use throughout the presentation, such as pubescent, which is hairy. There's also 20 different other terms you can use for the type of hairs that you have, but just with hairs is pubescent. If something is smooth and not hairy, it's glabrous. If you're talking about something at the end of a twig or a feature, it's the terminus or apex. Axillary means found in the axil of a leaf, and I'll show a nice picture of what that means shortly. A leaf scar is a scar remaining on a twig after a leaf falls. A bundle scar is the remnants of the vascular tissue found within the leaf scars. They're like little dots within the leaf scar, and it's the remnants of the vasculature that sent nutrients and water between the leaf and the stem. And we'll see pictures of these very shortly. But just some terms to introduce, and like I said, there's a whole book of them. So important winter features, of course, are twigs. You can have the color, texture, and smell be identifiable. The buds have the size, color, maybe even number of scales, and the difference between flower buds and leaf buds. the type, color, and pattern of bark. You do have fruit in winter. The size and those distinctive features can help you identify. And of course, fallen leaves, while we don't want to rely on them, if available, they can confirm a tree's suspected identification. Like if you're thinking this tree is an oak and you see oak leaves on the ground, then you are hopefully on the right path. So just some examples of these characteristic features shown here, the pawpaw buds. We have these globular flower buds here, those spherical flower buds that are fuzzy, and this long vegetative bud, which will have the new leaves and stem next year. The deeply plated bark of the flowering dogwood, and the clusters of winged fruits or samaras of our tulip trees. So these all help us identify our trees in winter when we don't see the green on them anymore. When you're identifying something, whether it's in the summer or in the fall, winter, spring, and you're using the leaf arrangement, this will be the number one question on any key. What is the leaf or bud arrangement of your tree? Is it alternate, meaning that your leaves or leaf scars, the scars of your leaves right here, are occurring one at a time along the stem? Are your leaves or leaf scars or buds occurring two at a time along a stem, meaning opposite? Or are your leaf scars and buds occurring three at a time on a stem, meaning that they're a whorled? There's only one species of whorled tree in Maryland, and there's debates on whether these species are native to Maryland, but it is the catalpa. The catalpa has 3 heart-shaped leaves at each point, and is the only one that has a whorled arrangement in the state of Maryland. When you have things that are oppositely arranged, so leaves 2 at a time, you're in luck. It is going to be a lot easier to identify. In nature, just by chance, there is a lot fewer plant species that have opposite arrangement, especially those that are woody. If you have something that's alternate, it's going to be a lot more challenging because there are many, many, many more options for your suspected plant. For oppositely arranged species, I like to introduce the mnemonic Mad Vibes Lonnie. The maples, M, A is ashes, D is dogwoods. 5s for viburnum. Lonnie for the genus name of honeysuckle or Lonicera. You can add some others there, again, through associations with families, like elderberries are in the same family as our viburnums, the genus Sambucus. And the buckeye and horse chestnuts, the genus Aesculus, are in the same families as our maples. With ashes, you can put olives, fringe tree, privets in there as well. So understanding these plant relationships can help us kind of figure out, based on leaf arrangement, what our tree might be. So these are just examples. This is, of course, with leaves of what opposite arrangement looks like. Opposite arrangement, 2 at a time. It's much more visible with the honeysuckle. 2 leaves at a time. But what does it look like in the winter? The opposite arrangement is not just restricted to the leaves. The opposite arrangement can also be seen in the branching structure. So here we have a oppositely arranged ash tree that is showing that characteristic arrangement without leaves and in its branching. Now, it's not consistent. There are times where it's missing one, and that is just when a bud didn't grow, the stem fell, the stem got knocked over. Trees are also very good at self-pruning. When a stem is not, putting enough nutrients back in that it is taking from the tree, then the tree will self-prune and not put in nutrients to that stem anymore. So you might find areas where there's only one, but many examples or many areas where you do have 2 at a time. And just a couple of these can tell us that our tree is oppositely arranged. An oppositely arranged tree is most always opposite, and an alternately arranged tree is basically never opposite. And I'll show an example later of when an alternate arrangement can appear opposite and kind of trick us sometimes. So twig anatomy, what are the different parts of a twig? The twigs, of course, have the stem, the woody stem. They have the buds, and they have 2 types of buds. A terminal bud, which is at the end of a twig, Another name for a terminal bud is an apical bud because it's at the stem apex. We also have axillary buds, buds that occur along the stem. Another word for an axillary bud is a lateral bud. So those are synonymous, just along the stem. When leaves fall, they leave behind a leaf scar. So the remnant of the leaf on the stem is called a leaf scar, and those dots inside are the bundle scars. The twig scars aren't too important. We don't see those as much in the identification keys. So I wouldn't worry too much about them. The very important ones are the terminal buds, axillary buds, leaf scar, and stem. And sometimes buds will even have scales, like the ones pictured here. The buds are scaled, and they kind of overlap. And sometimes the number of scales can even help us with identification, whether they're 0, 1, 2, or many. So terminal versus axillary, just another very quick view of the difference of the positioning of buds and both of the terms associated with what I mentioned from the last side. An apical or terminal bud occurs at the end of a twig. The axillary or lateral bud occurs along the twig. And this is showing it with leaves, and it shows an example what the axil is. It's just a space, an angle between the leaf and the stem. And in winter, you kind of have to imagine it because the leaf is not there. Again, another view of what axil is. Imagine the leaf and the stem. There's this little space here. This is an axil, and a bud just sits right there waiting for next season to open and bear new stems and new leaves. So flower buds versus leaf buds, as I'm talking a lot about these. Flower buds, if there is a distinction, if there is a difference between a flower bud and a leaf bud on a stem, which is not all the time, the flower buds tend to be bigger, fatter, rounder. On some species, the flower buds even open before the leaf buds. And leaf buds tend to be pointed, smaller, so less significant and inconspicuous. So there are buds that can include both leaves and flowers. For example, the terminal buds in a horse chestnut have this characteristic. They are very large and they hold all the energy for the new stem, leaves, and flowers for the next growing season. But there are some species which their flower buds and their location are very identifiable, like the pawpaw, or just the size of the buds at the end, like the horse chestnut, can become very characteristic. Some buds at the ends of the twigs are kind of faking like they're at the end of the twig because they're actually, the buds have 2 scars on either side of them, a leaf scar from the remnant of a leaf and a shoot scar or stem scar from the stem actually extending beyond that bud in the past, and that twig extension dying off before the end of the growing season. So this was an axillary bud that's now faking to be like a terminal bud. You don't really see that terminology, not in the Witcher Tree Finder, but if you do move up in keys, you do see pseudo-terminal referenced sometimes. So this is, again, another resource you can use for when that term comes up. What does it mean? It's an axillary bud that's acting like a terminal bud. So leaf scars, when leaves fall, they leave behind a scar. Some of those scars are very distinctly shaped, like the face of the monkey that we see here with black walnut. The face is also helped be visualized and imagined through the bundle scars, which are the darker spots within the leaf scar. So these are the remnants of the vasculature that sent nutrients and water between the leaf and the stem. So these are remnants of those, and we call those bundle scars because the vasculature is called vascular bundles, and the leaf scar, of course, because there was a leaf attached. Now the usual is that big leaves leave behind big leaf scars. Small leaves leave behind small leaf scars. So the black walnut has a very large 1 foot long leaf. So this leaf scar is quite large. And the bigger the leaves, the larger the leaf scar. When we go down further onto mature stems, we can use lenticels to help us identify our trees and shrubs. Lenticels are gas exchange pores that exchange gas between the atmosphere and the internal tissues of the woody plant. You can have raised lenticels like that of the spice bush. You can see the shadows that are created by the raised white dots or the white lenticels on the spice bush stem. You can have horizontal lenticels like that of our black cherry, the horizontal lines on the peeling scales of our black cherry. And you can have diamond shaped lenticels like that of our non-native white poplar. The size can also help to identify. These are quite large. And other non-native cherries, these horizontal lenticels can be very prominent and very, very large, or they can be very small. Other things you can find on the stems and even the bark in some cases are thorns and other protuberances. A thorn, like pictured here in the honey locust, is a stiff, woody, modified stem with a sharp point. So the honey locust is what we call triple thorn, triacanthos, 3-thorned. They're just ridiculously thorned. So this being a modified stem, it has xylem and phloem, it has the vasculature, it has the ability to move nutrients between the stem or the thorn with the rest of the tree. A spine is a stiff, slender, sharp-pointed structure that's really just a modified leaf. So it's a sharp leaf-like structure. A prickle is a small, sharp outgrowth of the epidermis or bark of the plant. Multiflora rose is an example of a prickle. So I always have to mention that the song that goes, "Every rose has its thorn," is actually wrong. It's "Every rose has its prickle." You can also have plants that are winged, like our sweet gums, or our non-native Euonymus elatus or burning bush, also called winged Euonymus, or firm protuberances called warts, like the bark of our hackberry, Celtis occidentalis. And just get a view of the side-by-side of a thorn. A thorn is typically associated with a leaf scar because they are modified stems, so they have to come from a bud. So these have a leaf scar there and a leaf scar there, and they're kind of evenly spaced. Prickles, because they're just an outgrowth of the epidermis of the stem, they don't really need to be associated with a certain location, so they can be quite variable along the stem where you find them. And then you have the spines. These are modified leaves. These can only occur at any point where you find a leaf scar or a bud. They can't occur like a prickle anywhere along the stem. And then sometimes you also have bristles, which are hair-like features. So they're a short, stiff hair or hair-like feature. So on the wineberry that we see here, we have both straight, very sharply pointed prickles and many, many hair-like bristles. On wineberry, those bristles even have like this little dot at the end. They have glandular tipped hairs. So these hairs are tipped with glands. And these glands secrete sugary substances that attract insects. This feature is very noticeable in spring and summer when the glands are active, not as active in the winter. But it definitely makes wineberry a horrible plant to manage. I was pulling prickle splinters out of my fingers a few days ago after managing a whole patch of wineberry. Not fun. And of course, it's hard to talk about winter tree identification without talking about bark. Michael Wojtek has written an entire book on bark and how to identify trees primarily using the bark. It's a great resource. I highly recommend it. I also highly recommend just exploring the rest of the winter tree features that we find on our trees and not always relying on one feature to identify things at any time of the year. You'll also notice that the field guide to bark is more for the Northeast. For Frederick County, I think that's okay, but trees like persimmon are not found in the book because it has a more Southeastern distribution. So he lists various different types of bark, like the smooth, unbroken bark, that it's not peeling, cracked, or furrowed, like the smooth gray bark of our beech trees. Bark that's peeling horizontally in curly strips, like that of our river birch. Bark that has visible lenticels on otherwise smooth bark, like these horizontal lines on our cherries. This is, of course, a picture of a non-native cherry that can show its horizontal lenticels much more prominently, since the bark doesn't break up into the scales that we see in our black cherry. We can also have vertical cracks and seams and otherwise smooth bark, like our hickory. Those cracks and seams can also reveal the color of the inner bark, like this red that we see poking through. A very beautiful color in winter that I enjoy seeing on our hickories. We can have scales, like our black cherry I've mentioned a few times already. Plates, larger and typically thicker and stiffer than our scales, like that of the flowering dogwood. Strips, vertical strips that are at least 3 times longer than wide, as in our red maple, seen here, these vertical strips. And then we have different types of ridges and furrows. So ridges are like the tops of the mountains, and the furrows are like the canyons between the ridges, this darker space here. And there are various different types of ridges and furrows, those that intersect very frequently. This is an ash. We have our ridges intersecting and crisscrossing, forming these diamond shapes. So white ash and green ash show this feature quite frequently. Ridges broken horizontally, so you can kind of like draw horizontal lines to break up the ridges. This is a black oak. Or those that are uninterrupted, these dark lines that are uninterrupted for at least 12 inches or more, like that of our northern red oak, Quercus rubra. So those are a lot of bark types, and the book provides a lot of great pictures, but here's a kind of characteristic look at each of those types with the pictures I provided today. So there are some fruits that we do see over the winter, and there's a whole bunch of different types of fruit. Typically, we see our drier fruits, the dry fruits in our winter because they don't decompose as quickly. So we have our dry and dehiscent fruits. These are fruits that at maturity do not open on their own. They typically require either some sort of decomposition or an animal to help open that seed up and to germinate in the soil. So we have achenes, like the achene. If you imagine a sweet gum, those are a group of pointed achenes kind of like stuck together. They've changed recently the fruit name for sunflowers or fruits in the Asteraceae family, the aster family. They all call them a cypsilla now, because it's a dry and dehiscent simple fruit with kind of like a fluffy thing in it. If you think of dandelion, the fluffy thing that helps with wind dispersal. So it has its own name now. They did that recently. So always learning new stuff, even myself. Of course, you have grains. We don't see as many grains. Of course, it's not a woody plant. And then we have, of course, we see a lot of nuts like acorns and walnuts and hazelnuts, chestnuts, beech nuts. Many nuts can be found throughout winter, and some of the shapes and sizes and prickliness of them can help identify our species. We also have other dry fruits, dehiscent ones that split open on maturity, like a legume. So we see the pods of the redbud all along the stems that move around and hit each other in the wind, making a very distinctive noise that's identifiable throughout the winter. Legumes are our third most diverse plant group in the world, with over 20,000 species, and we have quite a large diversity of them here in Maryland. We also have capsules that open up at maturity, like cotton poppy, or native to here, our witch hazel. These are its capsules. Skyzocar I'm not going to go into. We also have samaras, which are not on here, but we'll talk about some samaras later with maples and tulip tree. And we do see some fleshy fruits, but there are different types. I'm not going to go too much into them, but you have a berry, which is like a blueberry. A drupe are the fruits with a stony pit. So a cherry would be an example of a drupe, or a plum. You never want to eat the pit of the cherries because they do have some toxins in them. Always want to just enjoy the fleshy outside. Apples are its own thing, the pome. You can have aggregates like raspberry that are many fused together, or pineapples where it's many fused together, but from multiple different flowers, not even just from one flower. Figs also do that as well. But we definitely want to pay attention more so to the dry fruits because those are ones we more frequently see in the winter months. So I want to I always want to have an interactive component of the presentations because it does help with trying to, instead of just being talked at, to try to apply some of the knowledge that you're learning onto some twigs. So I have some arrows that are going to point, and I hope that we can chime in or put in the chat. I think put in the chat easier so you don't have to worry about muting what the feature the arrow points at. So let's try to use the chat, and we'll go through this kind of quickly so we can still get a sense of what our terms are and get through the rest of the presentation. But what is this arrow pointing at? Terminal bud, exactly. Thank you, Deb. So I'm trying to move so terminal bud, what about the what this is pointing at now? Oh, I went too far. So okay, so that's the axillary bud. It's along the stem. My chat box was covering up the axillary bud. So the terminal bud at the end of the stem, the axillary bud along the stem. And now what's these two arrows pointing at? Leaf scars, exactly. Getting lots of leaf scars. And I think so within the leaf scars, there's those little dots. Do we remember what those dots are remnants of? Bundle scars, exactly. Kathy, thank you. There is another feature in here that's identifiable of this plant family. I don't think we went over it yet, so I'm not expecting anyone to know, but there's these lines that encircle the stem. They go around. They're remnants of a different feature on the plant. This feature can sometimes be pointed, and we actually did mention the term when we talked about our types of protuberances. This is a stipular scar. So these were leaf-like features called stipules. They're like mini leaves that don't hang on very often to the stem. They leave behind this scar that goes all the way around, leaving this ring. This ring of stipular scars is very identifiable of plants in the magnolia family. So all magnolias, as well as this species, the tulip tree, have these stipular scars. I'll mention one other species outside the family that has the stipular scars a little bit later when we get to that plant. But the other features that help identify tulip tree is this distinctly long bud that people typically apply a duckbill shape to, and it tends to be kind of a purplish green, greenish purple. All right. So here's a picture of those stipules. Stipules. Oh, so these are the bud scales. Here are the stipules. And they go around the stem and they leave the scars. Okay, there's my arrow. What are we looking at there? And if anyone wants to chime in too on the chat on how many are there at the end of the arrow, it might be hidden by your so terminal bud. Thank you, Nancy. There are actually 2 terminal buds at the tip here. So one, it is oppositely arranged because it has the 2, but most of the time, even on an oppositely arranged tree, they will still end in one distinct terminal bud. Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time. In this case, the tree actually ends in a pair of buds, which is actually an identifiable feature of this species. And I'll reveal the species after we do the next term. Okay, so what do we have here? The little buds in this location. The axillary bud or lateral bud, both terms that we see in the chat. Thank you so much. The axillary buds. Remember, it's opposite, so there are 2 at a time. So it's kind of hidden on the other side of the stem. Hard to get a perfect picture to help with these situations. This species is actually a non-native species. It is actually the non-native species that I deal with primarily in the forest of Woodend Sanctuary in Chevy Chase. This is Japanese maple, Acer palmatum. It is my #1 invasive tree. It's very challenging, but its stems always end in a pair of buds. So very easy to identify in winter and very easy, especially when I'm trying to remove them. All right. We'll do one more twig. So what do we have at the tip there? So we have, I'm gonna give some answers so we can make sure to get through. This is our terminal buds. And in this group of trees, the terminal buds are often clustered. You have a cluster of buds at the terminus of the twig. You can have 2 to 5 just clustered together, kind of grouped in one location. This is typical of our oaks. And here we have our axillary or lateral bud. Our leaf scars are remnants of our leaves. And then I want to see if we can chime in on this one. What are the names for the dots, these little white dots that occur along the stem? Lenticels. Thank you, Deb. Thank you so much. All right. So I hope that helps to kind of ingrain that terminology a little bit more, since we'll apply it to some of our common trees in the area in the following slides. So I will first talk about oaks. Oaks are a very important tree group of tree species in our region. There are many species, over 30, that are native to throughout Maryland, from the coastal plain to the mountains. But there are 2 distinct groups of them, the red oak group and the white oak group. So they have identifiable features that help you at least get to the group, and from there you can more easily get to the species of oak you're looking at. For the buds, both groups have clustered buds at the ends of the twigs. The white oak group tends to have rounded buds that are variably pubescent, variably hairy. The red oak group buds are typically more pointed or conical and are mostly smooth or glabrous. The white oak bark, you can see that I use tend and usually because, there are things that break the rules, and there will always be, we like to joke that the plants don't read the books that we write for them. So variability is very common in nature. For our bark, our white oak groups tend to have a light gray, flaky, or plated bark, and our red oak groups tend to have a dark gray or brown bark that is ridged or grooved in texture. The acorns also differ in terms of how long they take to mature. White oak group acorns only take 6 months to mature, to go from flower to a fully mature acorn that's ready to become a new tree. For red oak groups, it actually takes 2 growing seasons, a full 18 months, to go from flower to an acorn that's ready to become a new tree, which means there is a winter period where you can find the most adorable little baby acorns growing on the stems of red oak group trees. And here is what they look like. This is a little baby acorn. They're so adorable. So I have this picture here of a willow oak. And it shows kind of like differently aged ones. These are very, very new ones. These are ones that just started growing that growing season. And these are ones that are gonna fall in the next one. So you can see these 2 little twirly things, these little curls. You can see the little curls here too. There's little curls. That kind of that's the feature that separates it from a bud. The buds will not have those curly features. These curly features are the remnants of the female part of the flower, called stigmas. These are the features that caught the pollen and allowed for the fruit to be fertilized and for the acorn to form. So red oak group trees, you can always find these, always find these baby acorns on the stems. Now we just went through, or at least in my area, I don't know about Frederick County, at least in my area, we just went through a mast year. So we'll see how many what our acorn production is like in the following year. I was looking on some of the trees today and was able to find some baby acorns to show some people I was teaching a class to today. So we'll see, but it's a pretty reliable feature on our red oak group trees. You can see our pointed buds, a feature of our red oak group trees as well. So just to introduce our kind of like our type species for our red oak group, the northern red oak, Quercus rubra. Leaf scars are typically alternately arranged, but they also have the cluster at the tip. The bark is very dark gray, these dark gray streaks in contrast to lighter gray streaks as well, typically compared to like a ski slope pattern, like skis running down the bark of a tree. We have our white oak, or a Quercus alba, our Maryland state tree, which their buds are much more rounded, shorter, but clustered as well at the tip. it has like two types of bark, the plated light gray and then the peeling light gray. This is typically towards the bottom of the trunk. And as you look up the trunk, you start to see the bark peel more rather than become plated. And the nice round lobes that we see here on the leaves that you can find below the tree. These are all in the beech family, so very closely related to our American beech, as well as our chestnuts. The Flora Virginia is a great resource. There's an app version that's $20 where you can get the book that's $80. But the book does have this nice illustration of all the variability of acorns that they are listed here. If you would, and like I said, this is provided to you as a resource, has measurements. In the Winter Tree Finder, they don't use the acorn to help you identify oak trees. What they do is actually use the shape of the cap. It's so challenging sometimes to get to an accurate ID for oaks in the winter. It can be very hard. You have to have the exact right features for certain species. So moving on to the other trees that are very common in our area, the hickories, as we typically our mature forests are oak hickory dominant. The hickories are in the walnut family. So you have mockernut hickories, the Caria tomentosa. Tomentosa is another word for hairy, but it takes hairy one step further to mean densely hairy, tomentose, very, very, very hairy. So the buds and the recent growth of the twig are very hairy. The bark is typically deeply furrowed with these interlocking ridges. So they form all these little diamond shapes. And if you looked inside the canyon, you'd see a nice red color. And the husks split all the way down to the base. And if you find the leaf rachis on the ground, so that's the remnant of the compound leaf of the hickory, that would also be hairy. And I'll show a picture of a leaf rachis in a moment when I show a picture of the walnut. Also, another hickory, bitternut, Caria cordiformis, very identifiable by its yellow buds. A very long yellow bud at the tip of the twig with smaller yellow buds, axillary buds along the twig. The bark is a little bit smoother and you can see that red color a little bit better, but as it matures, it still kind of looks similar to the mockernut hickory, forming deeper ridges and canyons. The husk are splitting almost incompletely into four valves, not all the way to the base. You can see it kind of stops here halfway down at times. From Flora Virginia as well, another illustration of the different types of hickory nuts that we see. Caria glabra, the pignut hickory, as well as Caria ovata, the shagbark hickory. But those have their own distinctive features that help identify them, like the shaggy bark of shagbark hickory. So I mentioned rachis. Compound leaves have a rachis. So this is a leaf that is compound. This is all one leaf. And the leaf, instead of being simple and just one leaf blade, the leaf is instead separated into its own leaflets. So in winter, the leaflets fall, they decompose pretty quickly, but what's left over is the rachis, this leaf stem. And the length and the texture of that leaf stem, the rachis, can help with identification of your species. For example, the mockernut hickory rachis is densely tomentose. The black walnut rachis is long and curved. It can be over 1 foot long. As we see here, here's a black walnut rachis. So these had all the little leaflets that were green and turned yellow in fall. And this is what is left over of it in winter. A very long, large leaf leaves behind big leaf scars, as we saw earlier. The black walnut also typically has a very thick, rough, deeply ridged, dark brown to nearly black bark. Younger trees can start off as kind of a grayer and they mature to this darker color as they get older. So of course, this is the walnut family. This is the namesake for the family, Juglundaceae. And to move on to some of our other common trees, I'll go through these a little bit somewhat quickly so that we can practice and go through a winter tree finder together so that you can see what a dichotomous key looks like. So you have those tools and resources moving forward with your tree identification. So the rachis will be gone from this. So Nick, I'm answering questions. If I'm looking at a stick, how can I differentiate between a rachis and a stem. The rachis will separate itself from the stem. So you actually, for the walnut, you would find this littered on the ground, separate from the stem, because they're also deciduous, they fall off. And then of course the stem is still attached to the tree. This is typically more flexible. It's vegetative, it's not woody. So it bends, it breaks easily, it feels more leaf-like than like a woody stem, which is much more tougher and thicker and doesn't break as easily. All right, so for red maple, of course, maple, it is oppositely arranged. A red maple has very red twigs, small leaf scars, they're small leaves. There's gray bark with these vertical strips and very rounded buds. Silver maples, they have a very similar stem. Honestly, I think the best difference in winter to differentiate them is if you break the stem of a silver maple and smell it, doesn't smell good. If you can believe me, it's a pretty odorous when broken, while the red maple doesn't really have much of a smell to them. Sugar maples, in contrast, have a darker color, more of a brown, purplish brown to their stem as well as their buds. You can see the many scales of those buds. And the bark is more of a gray brown, and those vertical stripes become more furrowed or plate-like with age. But it's this difference in buds that make them much more identifiable. They just have an overall different look. They're darker in color. They're not as gray as our red and silver maple. Our Japanese maples, as I mentioned earlier, they end in a pair of buds. So instead of ending, so this is 3 buds, you have 2 axillary and 1 terminal bud. This ends in just a pair. And we like to call I like to call the bark similar to like a cat scratch post, like cats scratching down the otherwise smooth bark of the tree. Sugar maples do have bright yellow leaves, yes, but also Norway maples. You have to be careful. Our non-native Norway maple can look very similar, especially with the leaf color, to our sugar maple. So it's good to get a closer look at the tree. They're pretty challenging to tell apart in winter, as the features can overlap quite readily. So it's sometimes good to actually use the fallen leaves in that case to identify them. The sugar maple will only have 5 points, 5 like lobes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the Norway maple typically has 7. It's a much easier tree to differentiate in the summer when you can break a leaf off the stem and look at the color of the sap. The sap of a sugar maple is clear, while the sap of a Norway maple is white and milky. Moving on to a different group of trees, the elms. The elms are still around. Elms are one of my most abundant trees in the forest of woodland, primarily the American elm. They have a very distinctive bark, especially through age. The young bark is kind of squishy to the touch and flaky. So like it's very interesting. You imagine bark to be hard. It's like connected to wood. But when you push in on the young bark of elms, especially on a humid day, it feels squishy. You can push into it, which is very strange. But as the tree matures, you get these deeply ridged and furrowed bark, and the young stems are typically zigzagging. And it's because of a 2-ranked feature. You have a bud here, and then 180 degrees on the other side of the stem is when you have another bud, and 180 degrees on the other side. So it creates that zigzag pattern. The slippery elms also have that 2-ranked zigzag pattern, but the tips of the twigs tend to be quite pubescent, forming a grayish color. But otherwise, the bark features are very similar, and there's a difference in the fruits, but you wouldn't see that until spring. But it also has a squishy feature. Our black gums, I think the best feature here is the bark, the alligator bark that is usually the words used to describe the scale, the reptilian scale-like feature of the plated bark of black gum. This is Helvetica. I also have these short spur branches that I like to compare to like fingers, like little somewhat bent fingers with just one bud at the top. The branching from the main trunk are also primarily perpendicular. So the branches coming from the main trunk are typically 90 degrees, and creating a 90-degree angle with the trunk. Persimmon is another blocky bark tree, but they get blocky younger. So you'll see a small tree that's very blocky, whereas small trees of Blackum are not this blocky. They have to get pretty large to have this plated feature. Whereas persimmons start to form it very young. And when they're young, you can even see the orange color in between. And when you look up in the silhouette, you can see the triangular buds kind of appearing, kind of making this interesting shape all in the shadows. And they are dioecious too, so we have separate male and female individuals, so you're not always going to be able to find fruit. We talked about the tulip tree, the duckbill-shaped bud, can very, very purple in color, the stipular scars around the stem. And then when you look up at the tops of the trees, you see these groups of samaras, these winged fruits. And then the very ridged and furrowed bark that lended its association to poplar trees, even though they're not at all related to poplars. Poplars are in the willow family and are very distantly related from magnolias. The American beech, the smooth gray bark, the tan, brown, dried leaves hanging onto the trees, and the long pointed buds that you don't want to run into accidentally or poke your eye out. These long buds have all the growth necessary for the next year, the new stem, leaves, male and female flowers. The black cherry we talked about a few times. The lenticels is what they look like on the younger bark, and then as they mature, the remnants of the lenticels are just these dark lines on the otherwise scaly bark of the tree. Sassafras, a very deeply ridged and furrowed bark that has a red inner bark color. The new growth, though, the recent growth of the stems are very green, a very smooth green bud. Oops. Do beeches retain their leaves as they age? I guess I'm curious what you mean by retain. They always, each year, the leaves that you see are new leaves, but they're just very bad at letting go. So as the leaves transition through fall, they turn brown and they dry up on the tree. And then when the tree is pushing out new leaves in the spring, it pushes off the old brown leaves and bears the new green ones for that year. So they're always replacing their leaves. Each year, the tree bears all new leaves. Samara, characteristic of all maple tree types. Yes, every maple has a samara. The time of year of those samaras can be distinctive. So right now, if you looked at a tree and you saw those little maple fruits, there's only one species really that holds on to its samaras through winter, and that is box elder, Acer negundo. It has a very green stem, and it has fruits in the winter, whereas all of our other maples have long lost their samaras for the years. They have spread them far and wide already, whereas the box elder wing seeds are still spreading as we speak. The sweet gum, Liquid Ambar styraciflua, can typically have winged stems, very large terminal buds with the new stem, leaves, male and female flowers. Those female flowers form these spiky gumballs that are an aggregate of achenes. Each of these little openings is one fruit, so it's many fruits held together, like that of compared to that of like a raspberry. Hackberry, or warty protuberances here is the best feature for hackberry. I like to point out that it's in a very interesting family. It used to be related in the same family as elms based off of its physical characteristics, but genetics have actually revealed that it's in the hops family with hops and cannabis. Very interesting. Our American sycamore is another species that actually has a stipular scar that encircles the twig, but I think the best feature is the bark, the exfoliating outer bark revealing the striking white inner bark color. There's nothing like it. And then the fruit capsules drooping singly throughout the winter. I will go ahead and make my joke as I always do. My favorite thing about these trees is you can't get sycamore. So I love seeing them, especially in winter when that white just is striking you through an otherwise empty color of forest. For the flowering dogwood, we talked about the small plates of the bark, but you can also see two different types of buds at the tips of twigs, the onion-shaped flower bud and the small pointed leaf buds. The pawpaws we looked at earlier with the small rounded fuzzy flower buds and the pointed vegetative bud. And then of course our catalpa, where you can kind of see 3 leaf scars here. 1, 2, 3. This is a world tree. So there's 3 leaves at each point. It is the only tree in this area where you have 3 leaves at a time. And it's almost like the stem was cut off because it's missing a terminal bud. So it lacks a terminal bud and only has axillary buds. The leaf scars are almost sunken, so they create a shadow. And the long capsules of bean-like capsules can be found on the tree as well. So they're not a legume. They're in the same family as our trumpet creepers in the Bignoniaceae. All right. So we're just going to go quickly through this to kind of keep progress. I know we're right at 8, but I want us to just see what a key looks like so we know how to use it going forward if we do want to go out into the forest and be able to identify trees in winter on our own. So I'm going to run through identifying this tree pictured here with the winter tree finder. So the first question, ask if it's a conifer or needle-bearing tree. There are 3 deciduous needle-bearing trees that we could find, the bald cypress, our native larch, as well as the European larch. This was a deciduous tree, so our tree is not a conifer. Then once we determine it's a deciduous broadleaf tree, it is always going to ask about the leaf arrangement, alternate or opposite is always the first question for a dichotomous key. We have leaf scars one at a time. So our lead scars. Our leaf scars and buds are alternately arranged. Then when we move over, so once we make this decision, we move over to the illustration that shows this, the arrows one at a time. And it asks us about the twig thickness. If our twig is over or not over 1/2 inch, we're definitely not over 1/2 inch. So not over 1/2 inch. We're going to go to this little illustration. So we're at this little illustration. So now I think is asking basically if we have something that's related to a walnut or not, if the twig is very stout or thick and tough, difficult to break. The leaf scars are large and pale, somewhat heart-shaped, or a twig doesn't have these characteristics. I wouldn't call these, the end buds are not larger than the side buds. The end buds are the same size as the side buds. End or terminal or side axillary buds are all of equal size. So we don't have those combination of characteristics. So we go to this illustration on the next page. This illustration is already asking us about the buds clustered at the tip of the twig, which we do. So we go to that little illustration below. And there's only one species that doesn't have, that's not an oak that has a cluster of buds at the twig, and that is the pin cherry. So we have a bark without horizontal lenticels, so we definitely don't have a pin cherry. And we know now the star, we have an oak. So now this couplet with the star, these 2 decisions are separating the white oak group and the red oak group. The white oak group has the light grayer bark, and the red oak group has the dark smooth bark. Our bark is gray and flaky. So we have to now look at the buds. Our buds, are they either rounded or pointed? They're definitely more rounded. So then it asks about the ability to rub off the bark scales. Our bark scales can be easily removed. Very, very easily. So we know our bark consists of scales that are easily removed. So now is our twig hairy and is a post oak, Our twigs are not hairy at the tip. They are very smooth, so it's not a post oak. And then our only two options is white oak and or English oak, which is not pictured well here, but the tree is in a forest. And then look for the right ankle branching from the cluster of buds, so we know we have a white oak. And that is a very quick run through of a dichotomous key. These are some of the resources. Like I said, this presentation has been shared with Patty, and when she sends the recording, I hope that the PowerPoint is provided alongside. It's in a PDF version, so it's much easier to share and download and store on your computer since it's a much smaller file size. You can learn more Nature Forward. I teach a whole bunch of nature classes and field trips. And in January through February, I will be doing a 5-week intensive winter tree ID course with 3 field trips. Sugarloaf Mountain is one of them in Frederick County, but we'll start in the coastal plain at Jug Bay. We'll go to Woodend Sanctuary in the Piedmont and then get a taste of the mountains at Sugarloaf Mountain. You can email me for more information. I'll put a link to the Natural History Field Studies program. Steve, when you ask, is that the oak tree that keeps his leaves through the winter? Are you asking about the white oak? Because most oak trees do hold on to the leaves through winter, not just white oaks. Most oaks, all the oaks, at least hold on to a few of them, if not all of them. The beech trees are the ones that hold on to most of them. So thank you for taking the time to sit with me today and listen to all of my winter tree ID tips and skills. I hope you are able to take them home and use them in your own local forest.
Thank you for joining us tonight. This was really informative. It's a great refresher for me. I've taken some of your classes, and just for the longer sessions, the field trips are fabulous.